Part 1. The Unseen Twist, a trial unlike any other. The Los Angeles County Courthouse hummed with restless energy, the air thick with the scent of polished oak and stale coffee. Every seat in the gallery was filled, spectators murmuring as they leaned in, sensing something unusual about today's trial. The moment Judge Robert Harrington entered, the room fell silent, the only sound being the subtle tap of his gavel against the bench. At the defendant's table stood Ethan Parker, 19 years old, dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans, hands tucked casually in his pockets. He looked out of place against the cold, unforgiving backdrop of the courtroom. His brown eyes, sharp and unshaken, scanned the room, not with the nervousness of a guilty man, but with the measured focus of someone calculating his next move. On the other side, Mitchell Carrington, the seasoned prosecutor, adjusted his silk tie, his confidence radiating from the smirk on his face. He had won hundreds of cases like this, and to him, this was no different, just another reckless teenager caught stealing a car. Another conviction he could add to his flawless record. Judge Harrington settled in, flipping lazily through the case file before exhaling in irritation. His voice carried the weight of boredom and disdain. Right finger, all right, let's get this over with. I have a golf game at 2. Mr. Parker, I assume you'll be letting your public defender speak for you? A few chuckles rippled through the room. Even the bailiff smirked. To them, this was entertainment, a predictable farce with a foregone conclusion. Ethan didn't even blink. He was used to people underestimating him. Red circle if you think Ethan is about to prove them all wrong. Hit that like button and comment 1 below. If you don't, comment 0. And if you have no opinion, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button for more powerful stories like this. Red circle. Carrington stood, addressing the jury with the polished ease of a man who had already won. Right finger, ladies and gentlemen. The state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this young man was caught in possession of a stolen vehicle, a brand new 2022 Audi A6. Officers pursued him, and when they attempted to apprehend him, he ran. Carrington walked toward the jury, every step measured, rehearsed, commanding. Right finger, his fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. We have eyewitness testimony. The evidence speaks for itself. Judge Harrington nodded approvingly, already halfway convinced. Right finger, sounds straightforward to me. And for most people in the room, it was. The facts appeared airtight: a stolen car, a chase, an arrest, an open and shut case. Except, it wasn't. Red circle if you're hooked on this story. Don't forget to subscribe to RVM Black Struggles for more gripping real-life inspired narratives. Red circle. Ethan turned to his court-appointed lawyer, Lisa Thornton, who had barely spoken a word since stepping inside the courtroom. As she shifted in her seat, preparing to speak, Ethan lifted a hand, a silent request for her to step aside. Then, in a calm, steady voice, he did something that sent a shockwave through the courtroom. Right finger, Your Honor. I'll be representing myself. The room fell into absolute silence. For the first time, Judge Harrington actually looked at Ethan, not just as another defendant, but as a wild card he hadn't anticipated. His brows lifted in amusement. And then, he laughed. Right finger, you'll what? The bailiff chuckled. A few reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Even Carrington let out a small, mocking laugh, shaking his head. Right finger, this should be interesting. Red circle think Ethan will pull off the impossible? Share this video and let's get the conversation going. The justice system needs accountability. And stories like this remind us why. Red circle. But as Ethan took his first step forward, something in the room shifted. The laughter faded. The spectators leaned in. Because for the first time, it wasn't a game anymore. Everything was about to change. Part 2. The game begins, the evidence stacked against him. A tense silence settled over the courtroom as Ethan Parker stepped forward. Hands still casually in his pockets. His eyes locked onto Judge Harrington. The amusement in the judge's face hadn't faded. But now there was something else: curiosity. This kid wasn't flustered, wasn't panicking. He was studying them, like a chess player analyzing the board. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, cleared his throat and strode to the center of the room, exuding confidence. He had seen defendants try to talk their way out of trouble before. But this was different. Ethan wasn't begging or pleading, he was calculating. Still, Carrington wasn't worried. He had this in the bag. Right finger, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Carrington began, pacing with well-rehearsed ease. This is not a complicated case. The defendant was caught in possession of a stolen vehicle. The evidence is overwhelming. Let's lay it out plain and simple. He turned toward the jury, gesturing emphatically as he spoke. Right finger, first, we have direct testimony from Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally saw the defendant behind the wheel before attempting to flee. The pursuit was conducted by the book, and the arrest was made swiftly. Carrington walked toward the prosecution's table, picking up a plastic evidence bag. He held it up, letting it glint under the harsh courtroom lights. Right finger, second, we have forensic evidence, fingerprints. Not just anywhere, but on the steering wheel of the stolen car. The defendant's prints were found right there, exactly where the driver's hands would be. Judge Harrington nodded, satisfied. He tapped his fingers lightly on the bench, glancing at Ethan. Right finger, all right, Mr. Parker, that's some pretty damning evidence. Any objections? All eyes turned to Ethan. For the first time since the trial began, Ethan finally removed his hands from his pockets, stepping forward with a slow, measured pace. His voice was calm, steady, too steady for someone facing a felony charge. Right finger, Your Honor. Before I respond, I'd like to clarify something with the prosecution. Carrington smirked. He had been expecting this. Right finger, by all means. Mr. Parker, clarify away. Ethan nodded. Right finger. You stated that Officer Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before my arrest. That's a strong claim. But I have one question. Was his testimony based on direct observation? Or on assumption? Carrington scoffed. Right finger, direct observation, of course. Ethan tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. Right finger, and his report, which contains this testimony, was officially submitted to this court? Carrington let out an exaggerated sigh. Right finger, yes, it was, and it states clearly that Officer Ruiz saw you in the vehicle. Ethan paused, then turned toward Judge Harrington. Right finger, Your Honor. I'd like to submit a formal request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If he was at the scene when he claimed, his GPS data should match his report. The entire courtroom shifted. Carrington's smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second. But Ethan saw it. Judge Harrington straightened in his chair. Right finger. That's an unusual request. Mr. Parker. Ethan shrugged. Right finger, unusual, maybe, but necessary. The gallery whispered in hushed tones. The bolder ones leaned forward, sensing the shift. This was supposed to be a routine case, but now something felt off. Judge Harrington looked toward Carrington. Right finger, counselor. Any objections to pulling the officer's GPS logs? Carrington hesitated. It was brief, a flicker of uncertainty, but in a room filled with trained legal eyes. It didn't go unnoticed. The jury noticed, the reporters noticed, and most importantly, Judge Harrington noticed. Right finger, no objections. Your Honor, Carrington finally said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. But the damage was done. Ethan had taken the first crack in the prosecution's case. And now, everyone in the room was wondering, what else might be wrong? Part 3. The first crack, a shocking revelation. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Judge Harrington nodded, signaling for the GPS records to be retrieved. The bailiff stepped out to process the request while the tension in the room thickened. Ethan Parker stood tall, hands still resting calmly at his sides. He had spent years studying courtroom dynamics. He knew when to press and when to wait. Right now, he just had to let the silence do the work. Across the room, Mitchell Carrington shifted in his stance. The delay wasn't long, perhaps a minute, maybe two, but in that short time, the power in the room shifted subtly yet undeniably. The confidence in the prosecution's case had been so absolute, so untouchable, until now. The bailiff returned, a tablet in hand. He handed it to Judge Harrington, who adjusted his glasses and skimmed the report. His brow furrowed. Right finger, Harrington? What is it? Carrington asked, voice clipped. The judge's jaw tightened as he turned the tablet around, showing the screen to the courtroom. Right finger. Officer Daniel Ruiz's GPS data does not place him at the scene of the crime at the time he claims. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Carrington's fingers curled around the edges of his legal pad as if he could physically hold onto control of the case slipping from his grasp. Right finger. That must be a technical error. Or an outdated system. Ethan didn't let him finish. Right finger, or maybe. Counselor. Officer Ruiz never saw me behind the wheel at all. The murmurs in the gallery turned into outright chatter. This wasn't just a simple mix-up, it was a major contradiction in the state's case. Judge Harrington turned toward Carrington. His voice edged with something dangerously close to annoyance. Right finger, care to explain? Counselor? Carrington set his jaw, flipping through his notes as if searching for something, anything, to counter the revelation. Right finger, Your Honor. The officer may not have been physically at the scene at that precise moment. But that does not discredit the validity of the evidence. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel, which, Ethan cut in smoothly, turning toward the jury. Right finger. Let's talk about that evidence for a second. He took a step forward. His posture still relaxed, but his eyes sharpened with intent. Right finger. The prosecution is asking you to believe that just because my fingerprints were found in the car, that automatically means I stole it. But let's consider this logically. His voice lowered, forcing the jury to lean in. Right finger. Let's say you go into a department store and try on a jacket. You zip it up, put your hands in the pockets, then put it back on the rack. A few hours later, someone else steals that jacket. Should you be charged with the theft just because your fingerprints are on it? A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery whispered something under their breath. Ethan didn't give them time to recover. Right finger. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before it was reported stolen. I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door, because it was already unlocked. He let that sink in. Then, with a voice sharp as a scalpel, he asked, Right finger, does touching something make you a criminal? Silence. Carrington's confidence was cracking, but he wasn't done yet. He quickly gathered himself, adjusting his tie before stepping forward. Right finger, Your Honor. While we wait for further clarification on the GPS data, I must remind the court that this case is not solely based on Officer Ruiz's testimony. The forensic evidence remains, and the defendant did not simply touch the vehicle. He ran when confronted by police. Ethan nodded slightly, as if he had expected this exact response. Right finger. That's true, he admitted, but that leads to my next point. He turned toward Judge Harrington, his expression unreadable. Right finger. Was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify today? The room stilled. Harrington blinked, caught slightly off guard by the question. He turned to Carrington. Right finger, counselor? Carrington hesitated. Then, reluctantly, too reluctantly, he answered. Right finger, no, Your Honor. Ethan gave a small, knowing nod. Right finger. So let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me. But they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence. No chance for me to cross-examine? No chance to challenge the accuracy of the analysis? Carrington's jaw tightened. Ethan pressed forward. Right finger. Did the prosecution even verify the chain of custody on the forensic report? Carrington didn't answer immediately. And that silence? It spoke louder than words. Judge Harrington let out a slow breath, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that this case was not what he had assumed. But Ethan wasn't finished, because what he was about to say next, it would change everything. Part 4. The crumbling foundation. The case starts falling apart. The Los Angeles County Courthouse felt different now. What had started as an open and shut case was quickly unraveling in front of everyone's eyes. The spectators, who had initially viewed this as just another routine trial, now leaned forward in their seats, eyes darting between the judge, the prosecutor, and Ethan Parker, the 19-year-old defendant who was turning the entire case on its head. Judge Robert Harrington exhaled through his nose, a telltale sign of his frustration. He turned toward Mitchell Carrington, the prosecutor, who had begun shifting uncomfortably. Right finger, counselor. The defense has raised valid concerns regarding the forensic evidence. Can you confirm whether the chain of custody has been properly documented? Carrington hesitated too long. Then, with forced composure, he cleared his throat and spoke. Right finger, Your Honor. The forensic report was submitted through proper channels. The absence of the forensic analyst in today's proceedings does not diminish the integrity of the evidence itself. Ethan let out a quiet chuckle. Shaking his head, he turned to the jury, his voice calm, yet cutting. Right finger. The prosecution keeps telling you to trust their evidence. But so far, we've caught them relying on a police officer whose GPS places him nowhere near the crime scene. We've caught them presenting forensic evidence without the actual analyst to confirm its validity. So I ask you, how much more are we just supposed to trust? A heavy silence settled over the room. Judge Harrington's gaze hardened. He was old school, he believed in the system. But even he could see the cracks forming. He adjusted his glasses before speaking. Right finger, Carrington. I want an immediate verification of the chain of custody on that forensic report. If there's a single inconsistency. Carrington cut in quickly, almost too quickly. Right finger, understood, Your Honor. But let's not lose sight of the core fact. The defendant was found in possession of the stolen vehicle. Ethan let the accusation hang in the air for a beat before taking a deliberate step forward. Right finger, was I? Carrington narrowed his eyes. Right finger, excuse me? Ethan's expression was unreadable, his voice razor sharp. Right finger, was I actually caught inside the stolen vehicle at the time of my arrest? Carrington froze. For the first time, true hesitation flickered across his face. Ethan turned toward Judge Harrington. Right finger, Your Honor. I would like to submit an official statement from the vehicle's registered owner. Raymond Whitaker. A rustling noise rippled through the gallery. Even Judge Harrington sat up straighter, his fingers tightening on his gavel. Right finger, proceed. Mr. Parker. Ethan pulled out a printed document from the thin file he had brought with him to court, a file that, until now, no one had taken seriously. He lifted the document. His voice was clear, unwavering. Right finger. In his initial statement to law enforcement, Mr. Whitaker, the owner of the stolen Audi, told officers, and I quote, I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid. He was white. Pushpin gasps erupted in the courtroom. Pushpin, a reporter in the back, furiously scribbled in his notebook. Pushpin, one of the jurors, audibly muttered. Wait, what? Carrington sputtered, his face now visibly flushed. Right finger, Your Honor. This is irrelevant. Right finger, irrelevant? Ethan cut in smoothly. His tone wasn't angry, wasn't rushed, it was controlled. Precise. Dangerous. Right finger. The prosecution has been parading around the so-called irrefutable evidence. But somehow, they conveniently left out the fact that the actual owner of the stolen vehicle gave a description that doesn't even match me. Carrington was visibly shaken now. But he wasn't out of tricks yet. Right finger, Your Honor. While it's true that the witness provided a description, that does not negate the fact that the defendant was found near the abandoned vehicle. His fingerprints were still on the steering wheel. His behavior was still suspicious. Ethan nodded slowly, as if he had expected that response. Right finger. You're right about one thing. Counselor, my fingerprints were on the steering wheel. But we already established that fingerprints don't prove theft. And as for my behavior? He turned to the jury, locking eyes with each juror individually before dropping the next bombshell. Right finger. I didn't run from the police because I stole a car. I ran because I knew the system would assume I was guilty before I could say a single word. And look what's happening right now. Silence. A devastating silence. Judge Harrington leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. This case was slipping into uncharted territory, not just legally, but morally. He let out a slow breath before finally speaking. Right finger, Counselor Carrington. Do you have anything else to present before I make a ruling on this motion? Carrington's jaw tightened. He looked at Ethan, then at the jury, then at his own notes, searching desperately for something to regain control. Finally, his lips pressed together. Right finger, not at this time. Your Honor. The gallery erupted into whispers again. Ethan knew what this meant. For the first time, Judge Harrington was truly considering the possibility that this trial had been a mistake. But just when it seemed like Ethan was about to win, Carrington made one last, desperate move, because Ethan Parker might have just exposed the prosecution's case. But Carrington was about to expose something about Ethan. And this case? It was far from over. Part 5. The Breaking Point, a game of desperation. For a moment, the courtroom was frozen in stunned silence. The case that had seemed so simple, a teenage defendant, a stolen car, a clear-cut conviction, had just been turned inside out. Ethan Parker had done the unthinkable. He had exposed lies, flaws in the system, and now, he had the judge and the jury questioning everything they thought they knew. But Mitchell Carrington was a veteran prosecutor. He had never lost a case like this, and he wasn't about to start now. So he did what desperate men do, he played dirty. Carrington took a slow step forward, smoothing out his suit as if he had just remembered something crucial. He turned toward Judge Harrington, his voice measured, but there was something colder, sharper beneath it. Right finger, Your Honor. Before you consider the defense's request to dismiss this case, I have one final matter to bring to the court's attention. Ethan stiffened, just barely. Right finger, the defendant. Carrington continued, his voice dripping with something almost triumphant. Has a history of delinquent behavior. In fact, I have reason to believe that this is not the first time he has been involved in criminal activity. Pushpin. The room shifted. Pushpin. The jury, who had started to lean in favor of Ethan, suddenly tensed. Pushpin. Even Judge Harrington's fingers paused on the edge of his gavel. Ethan knew what was coming. And suddenly, for the first time since this trial began, he felt something creeping up his spine. Dread. Carrington turned to his assistant, who quickly handed him a sealed file. He lifted it, letting the anticipation build before speaking. Right finger, Your Honor. The state requests permission to introduce new evidence that could reveal a pattern of behavior from the defendant. Pushpin. Ethan's stomach twisted. Pushpin. He wasn't expecting this. Pushpin. Because whatever was in that file, it wasn't just about this case. Judge Harrington sighed, clearly reluctant, but he was bound by the law. Right finger, proceed, counselor. Carrington flipped open the file, pretending to skim it over. But Ethan could see the way his eyes glinted, like a hunter who knew he had just trapped his prey. Right finger, 3 years ago, when the defendant was just 16, he was questioned, though never formally charged, in connection with an alleged break-in at a local electronics store. While there was not enough evidence to convict, police reports indicate that his name was associated with an individual involved in the crime. Pushpin. A murmur spread through the gallery. Pushpin. The jury started shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Pushpin. The judge's face darkened. And Ethan? For the first time, his breath caught in his throat. He knew exactly what Carrington was referring to. Because 3 years ago, he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, dragged into a bad situation by someone he thought was a friend. The police had interrogated him for hours, trying to get him to confess to something he hadn't done. And now, Carrington was using that ghost from his past to paint him as a career criminal. Ethan exhaled slowly. He had one shot to stop this before it spiraled. Right finger, objection, Your Honor. His voice was firm, unwavering. This information is irrelevant. I was never charged, never convicted. The prosecution is grasping at straws. Judge Harrington rubbed his temple, clearly debating. Right finger, counselor. Unless you have actual charges against the defendant, I'm not sure how this is admissible. Carrington smiled, but it wasn't friendly. Right finger, Your Honor. I believe this speaks to character. The jury deserves to know the kind of person we're dealing with here. Ethan clenched his fists at his sides. He could feel the shift happening in real time. Just minutes ago, the jury had been on the verge of siding with him. Now, Carrington had planted a seed of doubt. And doubt was often all it took to sway a verdict. Pushpin. This was no longer just about the stolen car. Pushpin. This was about whether the jury believed Ethan Parker deserved justice, or if he was just another troubled kid who got caught. Judge Harrington let out a long breath. Right finger, I'll allow the jury to consider the information, but only in context. Let's not lose focus on the case at hand. Pushpin. That was a loss. Pushpin. Carrington had gotten exactly what he wanted. Pushpin. The damage was done. Ethan forced himself to stay calm. But inside, the walls were closing in. Because for the first time in this trial, he wasn't sure if he could win. Part 6. Turning the tables, the final blow. The courtroom had become a battleground. Tension crackling like electricity through every corner. Ethan Parker could sense the jury's doubt radiating toward him. Mitchell Carrington's last-minute tactic had worked. He'd painted Ethan as troubled, dangerous, the perfect scapegoat. For a moment, it seemed the entire trial was spiraling out of control, slipping through Ethan's fingers like sand. But Ethan had prepared for adversity his whole life. This wasn't his first battle with unfair judgment. He took a deep breath, steadied his heartbeat, and stepped forward to deliver one final, decisive blow. He turned directly toward the jury, his eyes clear and sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution is counting on one thing, your fear. They're betting you'll judge me based on assumptions rather than facts. But I trust you to see through this." Carrington scoffed quietly, leaning back in his chair. Ethan ignored him, retrieving a document from his slim file. He raised it, allowing the jury to see clearly what he held. "This is the complete police report." The prosecution conveniently shared only half of it. They omitted the second half, officer testimony and surveillance footage from the gas station. "Evidence that fully clears me." Carrington froze, panic flashing in his eyes. Ethan turned calmly toward Judge Harrington. "Your Honor, may I submit this previously withheld evidence into the record?" The judge's brows lifted, astonished. "You may." Ethan stepped forward, addressing the jury directly, holding nothing back now. "Here is the truth. Surveillance footage clearly shows me leaving the store on foot. Moments after briefly touching, but never driving, the vehicle in question. Officer testimony confirms that another individual, matching exactly the description from Mr. Whitaker, was seen fleeing the scene minutes later. Behind the wheel." A juror audibly gasped. The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Ethan turned to Carrington, his voice cold yet powerful. "The prosecution deliberately hid this evidence, hoping I wouldn't notice. But I noticed. They wanted an easy conviction, even if it meant convicting the wrong person." Carrington stood abruptly. "Your Honor, I object." Judge Harrington's voice boomed through the courtroom. "Overruled. Mr. Parker, continue." Ethan stepped forward, every word now landing with precision and devastating impact. "The question today isn't whether I stole a car. I clearly did not. The real question is, why did the prosecution go to such lengths to keep you from the truth? The system only works if you hold it accountable." He paused, then finished softly, his voice resonating deeply with every juror. "Please, hold them accountable." The jury sat in stunned silence, looking between Ethan, Carrington, and the judge, absorbing the gravity of what had just been revealed. Carrington's face had drained of color, his confidence shattered. Ethan had delivered a knockout blow, and the entire courtroom knew it. But just as Ethan allowed himself a small breath of relief, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, revealing someone he never expected to see again. And suddenly, the case that seemed over was about to explode into chaos once more. Part 7. A shocking twist, the last betrayal. The heavy doors of the courtroom slammed open, causing heads to whip around. A hush fell over the gallery. Even Judge Harrington tensed, gripping his gavel as an unfamiliar figure stepped forward, a man in his late 30s. Dressed in a dark suit, his presence radiating quiet authority. Ethan's stomach clenched. He knew that face. James Calloway, a high-ranking official in the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office. And standing beside him, Officer Daniel Ruiz. Ethan's breath hitched. This wasn't supposed to happen. Ruiz had already been exposed as unreliable, his testimony discredited by the GPS data. So why was he here now? And why did Calloway look like a man with a weapon no one had seen coming? Judge Harrington's eyebrows furrowed. "Right finger, Mr. Calloway. You're not assigned to this case. What's the meaning of this interruption?" Calloway smiled, his voice smooth and composed. "Right finger, Your Honor. I apologize for the unexpected arrival. But new information has just surfaced, information that changes everything." Pushpin Ethan's blood ran cold. Pushpin, what could they possibly have left? Pushpin, he had torn their case apart. He had exposed their lies. He was winning. Then, Calloway handed a sealed envelope to Judge Harrington. "Right finger, This is a sworn affidavit, containing an eyewitness statement from Officer Daniel Ruiz, along with new photographic evidence. The gallery erupted in whispers. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. Right finger, objection. The prosecution has had every opportunity to present evidence before this moment. Calloway tilted his head, amusement flashing in his eyes. Right finger, you, of all people, should appreciate the value of last-minute revelations. Mr. Parker. Judge Harrington glanced at the document, then turned to Ruiz. Right finger, Officer Ruiz. You're under oath. Explain yourself. Ruiz stepped forward, his face unreadable. He cleared his throat before speaking. Right finger, I was mistaken in my initial report. The words hung heavy in the air. Ruiz kept his eyes low, refusing to look at Ethan. Right finger, that night, I did see someone behind the wheel of the Audi, and I'm now certain that person was the defendant. Ethan Parker. Pushpin. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Pushpin. The jury gasped. Reporters scribbled furiously. The bailiff even had to call for order. Pushpin. Ethan felt his entire world tilt beneath him. Right finger, that's a lie, Ethan said, his voice steady, but his hands shook. Right finger, you already admitted your GPS logs prove you weren't there. Ruiz swallowed hard, looking uncomfortable. Right finger, I got the timeline wrong. I wasn't far from the scene. And I recall now, I saw you. Parker, you were in the driver's seat. Pushpin. Ethan could barely breathe. Pushpin. He was being framed, right in front of the entire courtroom. Carrington, who had been on the verge of defeat minutes ago, suddenly straightened, confidence reigniting in his expression. Right finger, Your Honor. With this new testimony and photographic evidence, we request that the case proceed to verdict immediately. Judge Harrington rubbed his temple, looking visibly drained. He had been moments away from dismissing the case, and now? Now he had a sworn statement contradicting everything. Right finger, we'll take a short recess, he finally said, standing up. Mr. Parker, you better have an explanation when we return. Pushpin. The gavel slammed down. Pushpin. Ethan felt the walls closing in. Pushpin. They were cheating, and unless he found a way to stop them, he was going to lose. As the jury filed out, Ethan turned his gaze toward Officer Ruiz, burning with betrayal. Right finger, why are you doing this? He demanded, voice barely above a whisper. Ruiz didn't answer, but Ethan saw it, the flicker of guilt in his eyes. Pushpin. Something was off. Pushpin. Someone was pulling the strings. Pushpin. And if Ethan didn't figure it out fast, his life was over. Part 8. The final move, truth versus corruption. Ethan sat alone at the defense table, his pulse pounding in his ears. He was cornered. The moment court resumed, the jury would return with fresh doubts in their minds, swayed by a last-minute fabrication designed to crush him. They thought they had won, but they had made one fatal mistake. He still had one card left to play. The courtroom resumes, the last stand. The bailiff's voice rang through the room. Right finger, all rise. Judge Harrington returned to his seat, rubbing his temples, visibly exhausted. The jury re-entered, some still whispering among themselves. Ethan took a slow, deep breath as Carrington smirked, feeling victorious. Right finger, Your Honor. Carrington began smoothly. Before we resume, the prosecution formally submits Officer Ruiz's new statement and the accompanying photographic evidence into the record. I believe the jury is now prepared to reach a verdict. Pushpin. This was it, the moment they wanted to break him. Pushpin. But Ethan Parker was not done yet. Ethan's gambit, exposing the conspiracy. Ethan stood slowly, his expression unreadable. This had to be perfect. Right finger, Your Honor. Before this case is decided, I'd like to call one final witness. Judge Harrington raised an eyebrow. Right finger? Who? Ethan turned, locking eyes with Officer Daniel Ruiz. Pushpin. The entire courtroom stilled. Pushpin. Carrington's smirk vanished. Pushpin. Ruiz went pale. Ethan stepped forward, voice calm, but sharp as a blade. Right finger, Officer Ruiz. I want you to look me in the eye and tell this court, under oath, that you actually saw me behind the wheel of that car. Ruiz hesitated. A single bead of sweat formed on his temple. Right finger, I already gave my statement, he muttered. Right finger, yes, You did, Ethan said smoothly, and I think we should take a very close look at why. He turned toward Judge Harrington. Right finger, Your Honor. I formally request that Officer Ruiz's bank records for the past 48 hours be subpoenaed. Pushpin the room gasped. Pushpin Carrington shot to his feet. Right finger, objection. What nonsense is this? Right finger, overruled, Judge Harrington said, leaning forward, eyes sharp. I'd like to hear where this is going. Ethan faced the jury, his voice carrying the weight of everything he had fought for. Right finger. Officer Ruiz's original testimony was proven false when his GPS logs exposed that he wasn't at the crime scene. But suddenly, out of nowhere, he changes his story? Right before the verdict? Right finger, and just like that, the prosecution has conveniently new photographic evidence? Pushpin people in the gallery started whispering. Pushpin even some of the jurors began nodding. Pushpin they were seeing it. Ethan turned back to Ruiz. His voice soft but lethal. Right finger, who paid you? Officer Ruiz? Ruiz's breath hitched. Right finger, I. Ethan stepped closer, never breaking eye contact. Right finger, was it Calloway? Ruiz flinched. It was subtle, but Ethan saw it. The jury saw it. Judge Harrington saw it. Pushpin Ethan had him. Ruiz licked his lips, shaking his head. Right finger, I don't. I. Pushpin then. His shoulders slumped. Pushpin silence. Pushpin and then. Right finger. I was pressured to change my statement. Pushpin the courtroom erupted. Pushpin the jury audibly gasped. Pushpin reporters scrambled to write. Judge Harrington banged his gavel furiously. Right finger, order, order. But it was over. The house of cards collapses. Carrington's face was ashen. He turned to Calloway, who was already standing, grabbing his briefcase, preparing to leave. Right finger. You son of a... Carrington hissed under his breath. Realizing he had been used, Ethan turned to the judge. Right finger, Your Honor. The prosecution knowingly presented falsified evidence and witness tampering in an attempt to secure a wrongful conviction. Judge Harrington's face was dark with fury. Right finger, Mr. Parker. You are absolutely right. Right finger. This case is dismissed, immediately. Pushpin the courtroom was chaos. Pushpin cameras flashed. Reporters rushed the exits. The jury whispered in stunned disbelief. Pushpin Ethan Parker had won. But he wasn't finished yet. Aftermath. A new purpose. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was massive. Reporters, activists, strangers chanting his name. Ethan stood at the top of the stairs, looking out at the faces before him. His mother, Linda, was there. Tears in her eyes but pride in her smile. Then, a familiar voice. Right finger, you should consider law school. Kid. Judge Harrington had stepped up beside him, hands in his pockets, his tone unusually thoughtful. Ethan let out a breath, half laughter, half disbelief. Right finger, I was already on my way. Pushpin because this wouldn't be the last courtroom he stood in. Pushpin and next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. Pushpin he'd be the one fighting for the people who didn't have a voice. Pushpin because if the system wanted to play dirty, he'd be the one to clean it up. As the cameras flashed and the chants grew louder, Ethan turned and walked into his future, one where he would never stop fighting for justice. Rocket the war wasn't over. But this battle, he had won. Lessons from Ethan Parker's story, justice, courage, and the fight for truth. Ethan Parker's story isn't just a courtroom drama, it's a wake-up call. In today's world, the justice system isn't always about truth. Sometimes, it's about power, convenience, and who has the loudest voice in the room. Too often, people are wrongfully accused, pressured into plea deals, or fail to get a fair trial simply because they don't know how to fight back. The lesson? Never assume the system is infallible. Question everything. Demand accountability. If Ethan had accepted his fate, he would have been just another statistic, but he didn't. He fought, exposed corruption, and proved that knowledge is power. Small diamond, know your rights. Don't let others define your story. The more you understand the law, the harder it is for someone to manipulate it against you. Small diamond, stay calm under pressure. Ethan didn't react with fear, he strategized. In life, emotions can cloud judgment. Stay sharp. Stay focused. Small diamond, challenge injustice wherever you see it. whether in the courtroom or daily life. Stand up for truth. Corruption thrives on silence. Justice isn't automatic. It's something we fight for. Ethan's story reminds us. The system only changes when people demand it.